Hello and welcome back. Today we'll be jumping into the next part of making our platformer game. This next section is going to be introducing the creation of enemies, getting very simple activities for them to just walk back and forth, and implement the code to allow for our melee and for our shooting to interact with them. So to get started, this is going to be part one of at least two parts. This is going to go about in getting everything set up for us to do the actual code portion that allows for the enemy to interact with the player and get the enemy to walk around in our world. So getting started, I want to create two new sprites. So I created enemy astronaut and I created enemy astronaut dead. So for my enemy astronaut, I have this little sprite of this little astronaut walking back and forth. As you can see, it's going really fast. I'm going to drop this down to 10. That's a little too fast for me, maybe 6. Oh, that's reasonable. He's at like a nice brisk jog. Maybe if I drop that down to 4. Yeah, that looks calm movement. And so I have a little walking animation for my enemy. I called it enemy astronaut. You can call it whatever you like. You can replace the original enemy with it. I'm just keeping that sprite as a placeholder for stuff later on for testing. But we now have a very simple enemy that just walks around. I also have a sprite for enemy astronaut dead. Whenever we do kill the enemy, what my character or what my setup does is you first have this kind of flying back from the impact and then when they're resting on the ground. And so these are the two frames for the sprite, and I just call it enemy astronaut dead. You can of course call it whatever you'd like, so long as you can differentiate between them walking around and then their death state. Now that I've got this set up, we have our sprites created. The next part is going to be addressing updating our scripts. Currently, our scripts have, let me minimize this. We don't need these portions for the moment. Currently in our player state, we have several segments of code. I want to clean this up and pull portions of it out so that way we can reuse the parts that are shared amongst other characters. So where we have our collisions, our horizontal and vertical collisions, I'm going to cut this out, Control X, while that's on my clipboard. I'm going to go ahead and create a new script. This new script, I'm going to go ahead and make sure I rename it right now. Here, I'm going to call this movement collision check. That gets updated over there as well. And I'm going to go ahead and put this code in here. I now have a script that can address movement collisions. This has everything nicely set up. We can go back to our player state free, and where we originally had all of that code, I'm going to replace it with simply movement. Let me zoom in a little bit for y'all. I'm simply going to have movement collision, check those parentheses, and that is now our script just to address that. We call another script. Now this conveniently saves us time. In the next part, whenever we have to deal with movement, this type of collision checking, we're going to do it very often with anything that we add in that has walking or any type of movement in the game. So by creating this here as a script that we can call it elsewhere, we save ourselves the effort of having to copy and paste this and throw it somewhere else. So we've got this. The other part I want to throw in to a script after we've got the movement collision pulled out is addressing gravity. Vertical speed plus equals gravity, and create a new script. I'm going to quickly rename this to gravity. And it will just have this one line. We're going to cut that, throw it over here, make sure gravity is saved correctly, and go back to free and simply call gravity right there. So we now have gravity created. We now have movement collision check. I also want to go down. Let me minimize this. This is really just our animation. This is addressing which sprite to use, and down here, flipping our sprite. Based off of our horizontal movement speed, what direction do we face? I'm going to cut this, create a new script. This is going to be called sprite direction check. And this simply receives that little check, checking if the horizontal movement speed is not equal to 0. Then we're going to flip our direction. And I'll go back into our free state and put back in our sprite direction check. So we now have a nice simple check for our gravity to update, or collision to update, and our sprite direction to update. All very convenient, and so we don't have to address this later on in the future by copy and pasting stuff elsewhere. We just have it moved into scripts now that we can pull whenever we are creating the enemy sprite or enemy object. In addition to those, I want to create another script to determine if we are standing on something. Let's go ahead and create a new script. And this is going to be called standing on. And so standing on is actually going to be pulling in an object. We're going to specify what is it standing on whenever we do call it. And all it tells you, or all we need to do, since we're going to return a Boolean, I want to check if the meeting place of our current X and 1 pixel down is this object, whatever it might be. Now, the benefit for having this is we can elsewhere in our code check if we are colliding with something, or we will collide with something if we were to move 1 step down. So effectively, for our purpose, it checks, are we standing on top of an item? Now we can use this for the check on if we are on the floor. If we go back to our free state, this is actually this code, but passed into a function. We're going to replace this with standing on and obj_wall. And so whenever we're checking if we are on the floor, well, are we standing on the wall object? Now we can later use this to check if we're standing on any other item later on. If you wanted to differentiate what your player is standing on, maybe whenever we start messing around with audio, you have different tiles. The wall might be one sound, a different object the player stands on might be another sound. And so the script allows us to check, are we currently standing on this object? It'll return a true or a false. Now that we've got gravity, movement collision check, sprite direction check, and standing on, the last one that we need is a simple little code to put damage to whatever we end up hitting. And so this is going to create a new script, last script for the video, damage target. Inside here, we're going to receive however many points that we need to damage the target with. And their hit points should be minus equals however much damage they're receiving. And we'll explain this later once we get there. We want to have a flash equal to 3 frames. We'll get to this later whenever we create our enemy object, but this is going to cause a flashing effect for whenever we hit our enemy object. When we hit them, they flash to indicate that we have in fact hit them. This is for our convenience to clearly identify that we have some registering of the hit. Otherwise, sometimes the player might not be certain, did I actually hit the enemy or not? This lets us know that because the object that is getting hit is going to flash if we actually do the damage target. And so that won't apply to the wall because we don't want to deal damage to the wall. It will apply to all of our enemy objects. And so with this, we have now created our 4 scripts: damage target, gravity, movement collision check, standing on, sprite check, those 5 scripts actually. We updated player state to include this. And down below where we have our sprites, we can see that we now have enemy astronaut and enemy astronaut dead. You, of course, can rename it to whatever you need to. I just have enemy astronaut because that's what my object is. It's a little astronaut guy walking around. So with that in mind, that'll close off this video. The next video will have us look into creating our enemy object and updating our bullet and axe collisions to hit and deal damage to our enemy object, and then get the flashing effect whenever our enemies do get hit. But if you have any questions or need any assistance, just let me know. Otherwise, that's all we've got for today. Everyone have a good one.